Hello, boys and girls. Wait, let me try that again. Okay. Hello, boys and girls. Let us talk about tolerance. For this week, you read the Silcox short story, Monsters and Soldiers. You read a little bit of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. Um, you read the McFadden piece, MAGA, Morality and the Paradox of Tolerance. And you read a little bit of Marcuse's Repressive Tolerance. All of these pieces deal with tolerance in different ways, and I'm going to talk about the questions about tolerance that they address. I'm going to talk about the value of tolerance. I'm going to talk about the limitations on tolerance. I'm going to talk about what intolerance really means, and I'm going to talk about power and the role of power in how we think ethically and politically about tolerance. Okay, let's start with the value of tolerance. This is really what the Mill piece is devoted entirely to. So Mill's main thesis in a nutshell is that tolerance for speech, tolerance for the expression and holding of ideas that we might find disagreeable is important because it helps us discover and appreciate the truth. He breaks it down a little bit. He says, on the one hand, if you try to suppress some type of speech, that type of speech could actually be true, and so you're going to miss out on the truth in that way. On the other hand, or part two, I guess there's going to be four hands here. On the second hand, if you try to suppress some type of speech, even if that idea is really incorrect, even if the speech that you're suppressing really is false, it could have some grain of truth, some element of truth in it. And so you're going to miss out on that grain of truth or that element of truth. Okay. And even if the speech that you're suppressing is completely false, it's just 100% false all the way through, well, keeping false speech around keeps us on our toes in a couple of respects. On the third hand, it requires us to keep track of the evidence for what we believe. So if somebody says something false in your presence and you feel like you have to defend your beliefs, you have to understand the reasons for what you believe, which you might not have to if those beliefs were never challenged. And lastly, it requires you to keep in mind the meaning of what you believe. So, if somebody challenges you on a belief, you're going to have to sort of think harder about what that belief actually amounts to. Okay, all told, all of these are reasons to believe in freedom of speech and freedom of opinion that have to do with discovering and appreciating the truth. Okay, McFadden, for her part, doesn't discuss this at great length, but she notes that tolerance is an important part of modern liberal democratic societies. Not liberal in the sense of Democrats or whatever. Liberal in the sense of allowing for individual freedoms in how we organize our society. So one of the basic underlying ideas of modern liberal in this sense societies is that it's important to let people pursue their own conceptions of what a good life is, right? So you go off and do your thing. You check out Scrapple, you joining us? Okay. Scrapple's going to join us for a second. You go off and do your own thing. You pursue your own projects, your own passions. You form your own subcultures and your little communities, and you do your rituals. You have your religious communities, whatever. You do a version of life that's going to work for you. I'm going to be over here doing a version of life that's going to work for me. And in order for us each to be sort of free to pursue our own life projects and our own conceptions of what makes for a good life, we're going to have to tolerate one another. We're going to have to let different people do their own thing. So here we're talking not so much about tolerance for speech or ideas, but tolerance for ways of life. Okay. Another idea which comes up sort of obliquely or tangentially in Marcuse, but also came up in a lot of the discussions this week, is that if we were to be intolerant of people's speech or people's ways of life or people's beliefs, you are going to have to empower some group of people or some political institution or government body or whatever to actually figure out, okay, what are the groups that we're not going to tolerate, what are the ways of life or the beliefs that we're not going to tolerate, and how are we going to suppress them? And one argument for, oh, hello, kissy boy. One argument for tolerance is that you is that you can't trust any one person or group of people or political institution to do this. So maybe one good reason to live in a tolerant society is that living in an intolerant society requires us to empower some organization or individual or group to figure out what we should be intolerant of, and there's just no such group, organization, or individual that we can trust. It is too difficult and too consequential a decision to leave up to any one governing body. Okay, good. So these are three reasons why we might value tolerance. One set of reasons having to do with discovering and appreciating the truth. One set of reasons having to do with what's important in allowing each of us to pursue our own sort of life plans. And one to do with not making sure that we don't distribute power to people or groups or institutions that shouldn't have it. Okay. So much for the value of tolerance. What about the limitations of tolerance? Well, McFadden, but also Silcox, indirectly in the story, but also directly in the notes after the story, talk about the paradox of tolerance. And this is an idea from the philosopher Karl Popper. And the idea is that if a tolerant society were tolerant of intolerant groups, well, those intolerant groups are going to sort of rise to power eventually, and they're going to squeeze out the more tolerant groups. And so if a tolerant society wants to continue to exist, it has to be intolerant of intolerant groups. Okay. So this is called a paradox because it has this sort of surprising or counterintuitive sort of sound that, well, wait, how could a society be tolerant if it's intolerant of intolerant groups? But Popper says this is effectively the best form of tolerance that we could get. If we want to aim for tolerance, if we want to do the best that we can as a society to sort of capture the value of tolerance, we're going to have to be intolerant of intolerance. Okay. And here we're talking about tolerance for groups of people or ways of life, not just tolerance for beliefs or opinions. But if we focus on tolerance for beliefs or opinions, there's this idea that we get from Marcuse, who objects to Mill. Remember, Mill says that one of the things that's so great about freedom of speech, about being tolerant of other people's speech, is that it helps us all discover the truth. And Marcuse says, well, wait a second. If we just sort of passively allow people to say whatever they want, but there's some like big, powerful institution in society which is indoctrinating us into having certain sorts of beliefs, well, we're not all necessarily going to discover the truth collectively. We're going to tend to believe what we've been indoctrinated to believe, or what we've been indoctrinated to believe are sort of the boundaries of acceptable public discussion or something like that. Okay, so Marcuse believed that, the indoctrinating forces were the extremely rich, so capitalists, people who make their money from owning things, and the government which worked in their interests. Okay, so I mean, if you ever got the sense when you were at in elementary school or high school that your school was training you to be a good, compliant worker, and that this is the sort of training that everybody was getting in a society, this might give you a sort of flavor for the type of indoctrination that Marcuse was worried about. Okay, so Marcuse is saying, free speech is not going to be very valuable in terms of its ability to promote the truth if we're allowed to speak freely under conditions of indoctrination and propaganda and manipulation by powerful interests in the society. Okay. How do we respond to these limitations of tolerance? That is a really tricky question, which I won't attempt to answer in this teeny tiny little video. One thing that I will say, though, and this is something that came up in a lot of the groups, is that, so far in this discussion, we've been treating tolerance as a sort of a single thing. For any idea or group or way of life, you either tolerate it or you don't tolerate it. But, as is often the case in philosophy, things are a little bit more complicated than that, right? So, what does it really mean to say that we... Oh, okay, Scrapple's done. What does it really mean to say that we are intolerant of something, some type of speech or some group or some way of life? Well, if you're intolerant of some group or some type of speech or some way of life, you're going to want to discourage it somehow. But the types of discouragement that we could be talking about, the forms that intolerance could take, the forms that discouraging ideas or ways of life could take, are really wide-ranging. There are lots of things that could count as intolerance in the sense of discouraging some type of speech or belief or way of life or group. Okay, so one way to discourage a way of life or a type of speech or idea or something like that is to punish people for holding that idea or adhering to that way of life. Okay, so we could punish people legally. Let's just take speech. So we could punish people legally for some type of speech. There was a period of time in the history of Puerto Rico where the United States federal government made it illegal to sing patriotic songs about Puerto Rico or to wave the Puerto Rican flag. Okay, I'm not making this up. This is true. This is an example of legally forbidding some type of speech. It was really important to the good people who run the government that Puerto Ricans not be able to wave their own flag and talk patriotically about the island. Okay, so that would be an example of discouraging a type of speech, but we all have legally forbidding that speech, but we have all sorts of ways of discouraging speech, right? So we could refuse to interact with people who use this speech in various ways. So, there have been various boycotts of businesses whose leaders have expressed support for Donald Trump, or for that matter, who've expressed support for various political causes on the left or the right over the years. So we can refuse to interact with people on the basis of their speech through boycotts, through just unfriending them, through not wanting to be intimate with them anymore, not wanting to have friendships with them anymore, through ostracizing them, through sort of keeping them out of our social spheres. This could take all sorts of financial or contractual forms. So you could refuse to employ somebody, you could fire somebody, you could refuse to rent them an apartment or whatever. Anyway, there are all sorts of ways of, very broadly speaking, ostracizing or refusing to interact with somebody on the basis of their speech. That's one way to punish somebody for their speech, and that's to discourage that speech. Okay, you could physically attack people. Over the 4 years of the Trump administration, there were these periodic debates over punching Nazis. So, this is if we really want to discourage Nazi ideas, which are, on the uptick to some extent in the United States. Some people thought the thing to do was to beat up Nazis in the street. Okay, I won't take a stand on whether they were right. Maybe they were. You can also just express your disagreement or protest people. So you could go out into the street with your friends, wear a sign saying, I disagree with such and such. In the case that McFadden discusses of the student at UW who puts up anti-Trump signs around the campus, this is a way of discouraging pro-Trump speech or pro-Trump ideas. Okay, these are all examples of ways of discouraging speech through punishing people. Although, then again, if you really want to discourage some form of speech, there are other ways of discouraging it which don't involve punishment, right? So you could educate people. You could say, hey, here, have you read this? Or, hey, let's talk sometime. I can tell you all about my experiences with such and such, with whatever it is. You could, if people's beliefs are coming out of their unhappy circumstances or the social groups to which they belong, you could try to ease those circumstances, solve the material problems that they live with, try to guide them into healthier, at least from your point of view, social groups. Okay, so if you want to discourage some ideas, you can also educate people. You can improve their conditions in life, and then they say, hey, look at this nice person who believes different stuff from me, and they help me out. Or you can try to change the sort of tribes they belong to, the social groups they affiliate with, and from whom they get their beliefs. Okay, all of this is to say that there are lots of ways of discouraging ideas. And in that sense, there are lots of ways of being intolerant of ideas. They're not all morally equivalent. There are some ideas where you'd say, yeah, it makes sense for people to be educated about them, but it doesn't make sense for them to be illegal. Or maybe it makes sense for you to ostracize somebody. You don't want to be somebody's friend anymore if they have some idea, but you don't think they should be discriminated against for housing purposes. You don't think their landlord should tell them that they shouldn't get an apartment because of their bad beliefs or something like that. There are all sorts of ways of forms that intolerance, very broadly speaking, can take, and there's no one size fits all here, and it's helpful to sort of reread any discussion of intolerance and tolerance and their values and limits, bearing in mind the fact that intolerance can take all of these different forms. Okay. Last point, then I'm done, I swear. Okay. When you're trying to figure out whether and how to tolerate some type of speech, sometimes we think, well, really this is just a matter of the speech itself. What is the person saying? Are they saying something good or are they saying something bad? Are they saying something that's sort of within the realms of reasonable discourse? Or are they saying something that's outside of those realms? Something that's really zany or bonkers or dangerous or whatever. Okay. But that's not the only thing that matters, right? So when you're trying to figure out how to respond to somebody's speech, it matters who's doing the speaking and in what circumstances, right? So is the person a young child? Are they somebody who should know better? Or are they somebody who was in no position to know better? Is this person a person whose speech has a lot of power? Are they an influencer? Are we talking about, PewDiePie or George Bush or Ellen DeGeneres or, a perfectly normal list of people, or are we talking about just some rando off the street, or you or your friends, somebody? Are we talking about teachers? Are we talking about journalists? Are we talking about people with platforms, people with influence? Or are we talking about people who are just sort of, who might have bad ideas, but who are relatively powerless, who don't have that much sort of ideological influence over people? How we respond to types of speech, and in particular whether we respond in more or less discouraging, more or less punitive ways, is going to be a function in part of who the person is that's doing the speaking and in what circumstances. I would suggest to you that if you understand to take the Ellen case from McFadden, I would suggest to you that if you understand George Bush's relationship with Ellen, these two zillionaires with enormous power and influence, if you understand their relationship to one another on exactly the same model as your relationship to somebody who you disagree with personally, politically, you're going to miss something important, right? Because you and me and nobody in this class has the political power or the influence that either of these figures has. Okay, so that's the last point that I wanted to make, which is just that questions about whether and how we should tolerate some idea um, shouldn't abstract away from, shouldn't ignore who's doing the speaking, in what circumstance, for what audience, with what sorts of political or financial backing. Okay. Okay, we talked a little bit about the value of tolerance. We talked a bit about the limitations of tolerance and the circumstances under which it doesn't have the values that it might seem to have. We talked about what intolerance might mean and the different forms that it might take. And lastly, we talked a little bit about the relevance of someone's social position to discussions of whether and how we should tolerate their speech. Okay, hope that was helpful. Good. All right, see you guys next time.